Every few months, British politics seems to spiral into the same argument. Immigrants, foreigners, people of colour, they're the ones abusing the system. They're the reason for the strain on public services. They're coming in droves just to claim benefits. At least that's what the headlines scream. That's what some politicians, especially from parties like Reform UK, want you to believe. But what if they're wrong? What if the real issue has nothing to do with who's arriving, and everything to do with what they're arriving into? Because here's a bold thought, one that might upset everyone across the political spectrum. The biggest threat to the UK isn't immigration, it's cultural decay. Forget race, forget religion, forget the boats. What if the real rot lies in the heart of British society itself, in a country that has lost its moral compass, forgotten its values, and buried its Christian foundations under layers of apathy, entitlement, and bureaucratic coldness? In this video, we're not just asking questions, we're challenging the entire narrative. We'll look at the so-called benefit crisis, the real story behind hard-working migrants, and most controversially, how the UK's own broken culture is infecting everyone, immigrants included, because if we keep blaming outsiders while ignoring our own house falling apart, then Britain isn't being invaded. It's imploding, and no border wall, no policy, and no political party can fix that, unless we're finally ready to talk about the real problem. Let's get into it. You see, there was a time when being British meant something deeper, not just a passport or an accent, but a code of conduct, values, morals, a collective sense of duty, truth, and dignity. You didn't need to lock your doors because your neighbour feared God. You didn't need CCTV on every corner because people feared shame. But those days are gone. Now, honesty is negotiable, work ethic is optional, and morality is something you outsource to government agencies and HR policies. And when newcomers arrive, whether from Africa, Asia, the Middle East, they don't just enter a new country, they enter a culture. And if that culture is one of laziness, entitlement, and spiritual emptiness, what exactly are they supposed to absorb? You can't blame people for adapting to the environment they land in. So maybe it's time we stopped obsessing over who's crossing the border and started asking what kind of country they're entering. That's the conversation this video is about to start. To understand the dominant narrative, we need to listen to the loudest voices shaping it. And right now, that includes parties like Reform UK, segments of the Conservative base, and frustrated citizens across the country who believe Britain is under siege from within. According to this camp, the welfare system is collapsing under the weight of benefit tourists, people who arrive in the UK not to work or contribute, but to game the system. They point fingers at immigrants, particularly those from the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, suggesting these groups exploit housing benefits, NHS access, and child allowances while giving little back. Nigel Farage, for instance, has echoed the belief that the UK needs tighter controls, not just on illegal migration, but even on legal paths to citizenship, like indefinite leave to remain. His argument? That open immigration creates a burden on taxpayers and dilutes British values. And these ideas don't exist in a vacuum. They're echoed by media outlets, amplified on social media, and used by politicians to score easy points in tight elections. In a cost-of-living crisis, blaming outsiders is politically convenient and emotionally potent. Supporters of this viewpoint argue that British citizens are being pushed to the back of the queue, that jobs are being taken, that culture is being lost, that the country is becoming unrecognisable. But here's the thing, this narrative is emotionally persuasive but dangerously simplistic, because it assumes that immigrants are inherently exploitative and that British citizens are inherently righteous victims. It paints with a wide brush, ignoring nuance, ignoring evidence, and ignoring deeper truths about both groups. And most importantly, it distracts from the bigger issue. If everyone's taking advantage of the system, maybe it's not just about who's entering it, maybe it's about the system itself and the culture that created it. The truth is, no one wants to talk about the fact that British citizens also abuse the system, and not just a few. Generational benefit dependency is not a foreign import, it's homegrown. The welfare culture didn't start in Lagos, Islamabad, or Damascus. It started right here in Britain. We have a society where work is optional for many, but complaining is constant, where people know how to play the bureaucratic game and proudly teach their children to do the same. So when immigrants arrive and see this as the norm, are they corrupting the culture or simply adapting to it? Even more troubling is how politicians avoid addressing this cultural rot. It's easier to blame the other than to tell the uncomfortable truth that many of the problems we're seeing are the symptoms of a spiritually hollow nation, not just a poorly managed immigration policy. So while the Reform Party and others might be right to raise concerns about integration and strain on public systems, they're missing, or perhaps dodging, the real target. Because if Britain's national character is broken, then anyone who enters, no matter how noble, eventually becomes part of a broken system. And that's the real crisis. Let's get honest about something that most political commentators avoid. Immigrants are not inherently lazy. In fact, in most cases, they're the opposite. The first generation of immigrants to the UK are often some of the hardest working people in the country. They take the jobs no one else wants. They clean, cook, care and construct. They work night shifts, do the dirty work and rarely complain. They send money home. They build lives. And they contribute massively to the economy. If we removed immigrant labour from sectors like healthcare, agriculture, transport and social care, the system would collapse overnight. And that's not speculation. It's measurable reality. But you won't hear this from politicians fishing for votes. Because praising immigrants doesn't win elections, fear does. The myth of the lazy immigrant is powerful because it taps into a deep cultural anxiety. The idea that they are coming to take what we built. But in truth, many immigrants come from cultures that still value discipline, family, faith and hard work. Qualities Britain itself once held sacred, but seems to have lost. And here's the irony. Far from exploiting the system, many newcomers are holding it up. They're working in underfunded hospitals while being called leeches. They're paying taxes while being branded freeloaders. They're policing our streets while being demonized in our media. So where does the abuse actually begin? Not with them. It begins when their children and their children's children begin to absorb the very culture that resents them, when they start adopting the same laziness, entitlement and welfare addiction that the native population has normalized. This is the uncomfortable truth that no one on either side wants to face. The immigrant work ethic is real, but it's not immune to assimilation. And when you assimilate into a culture of mediocrity, you eventually inherit its decline. This isn't about preserving British values, it's about preserving the illusion that those values still exist. And this is where the real cultural betrayal takes root, because we've created a society where it's easier to criticize those trying to build something than to confront those tearing it down from within. We glorify complaining over contributing. We reward victimhood over virtue. And worst of all, we've made it culturally acceptable to see work as punishment, not purpose. Ask yourself, what message does that send to someone arriving in Britain for the first time? They may arrive with ambition, with drive, with a sense of responsibility to their families and communities. But within a generation, that drive erodes, not because of their background, but because of what we've normalized. We train people not through schools or sermons anymore, but through culture, through what we allow, what we ignore, what we silently endorse. So the next time someone blames immigrants for not integrating, we should ask, integrate into what exactly? Because if what we're offering is a morally rudderless, spiritually hollow, welfare-dependent culture, then integration is no longer the solution. It's part of the problem. We need to stop pretending that immigrants are the disease. In many cases, they were the remedy, until we infected them with our own cultural virus. And that should scare us more than any boat ever could. Let's stop dancing around it. The real issue plaguing Britain isn't immigration. It's not the boats, it's not the benefits, and it's not the birth rates. It's the slow, silent erosion of a national soul. Britain has undergone a cultural collapse. There was a time when honesty, hard work, discipline, and self-sacrifice weren't just virtues. They were expected, and those values didn't appear by accident. They were cultivated through centuries of Christian influence. Principles that once gave this country its spine. Today, that spine is gone. In its place is a soft, cynical, self-indulgent society. A place where moral relativism reigns, where truth is subjective and where comfort is king. We've replaced the 10 Commandments with 10 streaming platforms. We've traded reverence for rebellion, duty for dopamine, and sacrifice for entitlement. And the result? A nation that's lost not just its values, but its very identity. This isn't about being woke or conservative. It's about recognizing that a culture without moral anchors will drift and eventually drown. If you remove God from a nation, you remove purpose. If you remove purpose, you remove responsibility. And when no one feels responsible, no one feels guilty for cheating the system. This is what we've created, a society that encourages gain without effort, rights without responsibilities, and tolerance without truth. And immigrants? They're not bringing this with them. They're walking into it. It's easy to criticize newcomers for adapting to welfare culture, but it's much harder to admit that we're the ones who built that culture in the first place. We love to pretend that Britain is still a beacon of fairness, rule of law, and moral clarity. But let's be honest, the moral decay isn't at the edges of society. It's in the center, in our institutions, in our media, in our politics, in our homes. The benefit fraudster, the corrupt MP, the cheating student, the absentee parent. These aren't foreign imports, they're local products. This isn't just about what's changed in policy, it's about what's been lost in the soul. And until we reclaim those deeper foundations, no immigration policy will ever fix what's truly broken. Consider this, in earlier generations, young people were raised to believe that life was about service, to family, to country, to God. Today, they're told that life is about self-expression, self-pleasure, and self-preservation. Narcissism isn't the exception anymore. It's the culture. And this cultural drift didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, through decades of secularization, through the erosion of religious institutions, through a media that rewards vice and mocks virtue. We laugh at those who live with conviction. We ridicule those who call for restraint. And we dismiss anyone who dares suggest that morality should be more than a personal preference. And yet, we wonder why our politics is broken, why families are crumbling, and why no one seems willing to sacrifice for the greater good. A country that forgets what it stands for will soon fall for anything. And today, we're falling for the illusion that our problems began at the border. They didn't. They began in the heart of this nation, in the silent compromises, in the celebrated apathy, in the decision to make comfort king and character irrelevant. This is not just a political crisis, it's a spiritual one, and until we address that, every other conversation is just noise. Let's talk about the politicians, the ones who are supposed to be leading, guiding, standing for something. But what do they really stand for? Because in today's United Kingdom, we have leaders who would rather tiptoe around offense than speak hard truths. Leaders more comfortable managing narratives than defending values. They talk about inclusion, fairness, equality, but never about responsibility, accountability, or morality. When was the last time you heard a UK Prime Minister, from any party, speak boldly about restoring virtue? About confronting the collapse of moral fibre? About rebuilding the ethical spine of the nation? They won't, because that's not popular. Instead, they talk about the symptoms. They obsess over migration numbers. They juggle benefit statistics. They release endless white papers about social cohesion, but they never touch the root. And the root is this. Britain no longer knows what it believes in, and politicians are too afraid to say what they believe because they fear the backlash more than they fear the collapse. This is cowardice disguised as progress. It's moral neutrality packaged as tolerance. And in that vacuum, nothing thrives. Not discipline, not sacrifice, not truth, just noise. Until someone dares to stand up and say, this country needs to reclaim its soul. Everything else is just theatre. And it's not just national leaders. Local councils, school boards and public institutions have fallen into the same pattern, silencing anyone who raises uncomfortable cultural questions, while celebrating those who parrot safe, progressive slogans. Instead of fighting for truth, they manage optics. Instead of setting a standard, they lower the bar. When culture collapses, politicians should be the firewall, just like President Trump in the US. But in the UK, they've become cheerleaders for decay, too scared to speak plainly about the spiritual void at the heart of our national life. Think about it. We've had leadership that's openly indifferent to God, detached from any moral framework, and committed more to pleasing polls than preserving principle. And yet, we act surprised when the country feels hollow. When morality becomes a matter of preference, and faith becomes taboo, don't expect integrity to remain. If a leader won't say, this is wrong, or this is right, what are they even leading? Because leadership without conviction is just public relations. So no, immigration isn't the biggest problem in Britain. The real problem is a political class that's allergic to truth, addicted to comfort, and incapable of moral clarity. And unless that changes, no policy will. So what now? We've pointed fingers, we've exposed the decay, we've named the problem. But solutions? They don't come from slogans, they come from courage. If Britain wants to survive, not just economically but morally, spiritually and culturally, it needs more than border control. It needs soul control. And that begins with reclaiming values that once made this country strong. Honesty, duty, sacrifice, truth, faith. We don't need to go back in time. We need to go back to principle, back to believing in something higher than self, back to valuing character over convenience, back to understanding that morality isn't oppression, it's foundation. And here's the challenge, not just to politicians, but to every citizen. What do you stand for? Because if we don't rebuild the moral framework of this country, every law we pass will be meaningless, every policy will crumble, every institution will rot from within. Reform is important, debates about immigration are necessary, but they are secondary. Primary is this: what kind of people are we becoming? Until Britain remembers that it was once great because it was good, not rich, not powerful, but good, we'll keep spinning our wheels, blaming everyone but ourselves. This is a call, not just to defend our borders, but to defend our values. And maybe, just maybe, that's the revolution we really need. Start in the home. Teach children that integrity matters, that lying isn't clever, it's corrosive, that benefits are a safety net, not a career path, that loving your neighbor doesn't mean enabling their laziness, but holding them to a higher standard. Move to the schools, encourage respect, not rebellion, structure, not chaos, discipline, not excuses. Teach history with humility, teach values with conviction, and stop being afraid of the word virtue. Then demand more from leaders, not just in speeches, in lifestyles. Hold them to standards that actually mean something. Reward honesty, punish deceit, and stop clapping for cowardice just because it's wrapped in diplomacy. Britain has every tool it needs to rebuild. What it lacks is willpower. And it won't find that in a political manifesto. It'll find it in churches reopening, families rebuilding, teachers reforming, citizens remembering who they are. Because at the end of the day, immigration can't destroy a country. Only its own people can. This isn't about race. This isn't about religion. This isn't even about Reform UK or Labour or Tories. This is about a choice between comfort and character, between decay and discipline, between blaming others and rebuilding ourselves. What future will Britain choose? The debate on immigration is loud, emotional, and often misdirected. It's easy to blame the outsider. It's convenient to point fingers at migrants, at minorities, at newcomers. But the deeper, more uncomfortable truth is that Britain's crisis didn't come from the outside. It was born from within, the collapse of character, the death of shared values, the rise of entitlement over effort, comfort over conviction. We can argue over numbers. We can debate statistics. But what we cannot deny is this: no country survives long when it forgets what it stands for. And Britain, it's dangerously close to forgetting. We don't need more policy papers. We don't need louder parties or tighter laws. We need moral clarity, cultural courage, and a nation willing to look in the mirror and repent. If we don't address the cultural decay eating away at the heart of our country, immigration will continue to be the scapegoat for a much larger, more devastating decline. So before you join the next debate, ask not just who's entering Britain, ask what kind of Britain they're entering. Because that answer, more than any manifesto or minister, will decide the future of this nation. And if you believe that matters, if you believe it's time for this country to stop blaming and start building, then like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more content that isn't afraid to speak uncomfortable truths. This isn't the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of a reckoning. Let's rebuild together. And here's the part that matters most. This isn't just about politics. It's about you, me, all of us. It's about deciding, right now, that the decay stops with us. That we will teach truth, live it, defend it, and pass it down. That we'll no longer sit quietly while culture rots from within. That we won't just hope things get better, we'll make them better with conviction and courage. So as this video ends, ask yourself, what kind of country do you want your children to inherit? One that stands for nothing, or one that rediscovers everything it once held dear? If that future matters to you, hit that subscribe button. Join this growing community, and let's keep this conversation going, because culture can decay, but it can also be rebuilt, and it starts now.